just something a bit more grandiose, something put a bit of pizzazz into the show, I think, visually. I was glad he did it. We took a lot of heat from everybody on this. Originally, he had a sequence here where when Gur goes to find Zim, after Zim runs all over the place to find his way out, Gur then he calls Gur, and Gur comes, and he had animated it on his boards in a very Donkey Kong like old Nintendo video game sort of style. So he had Gur hopping around on all these girders and going through flames and other things in a very limited fashion, very Gur-like. For some reason, Gur and limited video games always seem to play together. Now, this poor blob got a lot of criticism from New York and standards. They, for some reason, didn't like the idea that this thing is being abandoned. They claimed it was like child abandonment. For some reason, that's a very big issue at Nick. Although it's not a child, or we have no idea that this thing's a child. And yeah, he is being abandoned, but I think everybody gets abandoned at some time, somewhere. And originally his wails were supposed to be heard throughout the ship for a long, long time after this. And there's even a whole sequence where Zim gets burned. He ends up going up one of these little pods here, gets transported up into a hole in the ship and burned. So basically these guys are frying all their aliens. They're just burning them. And Zim comes flaming out of the hole. And then you see this little alien going up towards the hole, crying and crying. And you hear the wails throughout the ship. That was cut out. That was a little bit too gruesome, I think, for standards and practices. But of course, the whole humor here is that Zim took the long way. Gur walks through this one room, and he's bypassed all the troubles that Zim had to go through in order to arrive at this escape pod. And I think the longer chase sequence helped show that it was just so ridiculous how short Gur's trip was, but it works fine as it is. When Gur and Zim fall out here in this pod, originally a pod, you can almost see there's a blank space when they're on the ground walking into the house. It was supposed to land on the gopher, so the gopher is half squashed there underneath this pod, and the gopher just wiggles. And as they walk into the house, in this shot, the gopher was just spazzing out there trying to push the ball off of himself. It was sad. It was a very funny Zim-like joke, just something tragic and brutal. And we weren't allowed to do it. But despite all we got away with, occasionally we took the cuts. I think the fans are really enthused to see these Jonan characters brought to life, these Squee characters. Ridiculous quick ending. Just like all Zim episodes. Chickenfoot is another Roman dirge story. I think he came up with this idea, and it was in the original set of premises when I came onto the show that were being turned into actual scripts. I never knew it was written by Eric, though. I never looked at the credit. This was a very hodgepodge episode, too. We ended up, in the end of the first season, getting into a very odd position where deadlines and desires sort of clashed. And we'd end up with more than 2 board artists on an episode. And this episode tended to have a lot of guys working on it. Many, many hands worked on this. Louis was biting the bullet and doing storyboard supervision as well as boarding out a lot of this episode with Joe Daniello. It had a lot of hands all over it. There was Miyuki involved, and there were several cleanup artists that went over top of the stuff. So the episode sort of isn't very cohesive in its film language. But it's kind of nice occasionally to have seen Dib sort of following his paranormal investigations. It was good to know Dib was into something else. Dib had a life outside of Zim. which was sometimes hard to show off in a little 11-minute short. But you do a little story about Dib every so often. It's very nice just to see him in his own world. I'm surprised that Nickelodeon didn't stop this. All very race-oriented characters, not necessarily racist, which is a big problem these days in society. You know, people feel because a French guy wears a beret or a German guy has a monocle, that's racist. It's racial. You know, I don't think that necessarily says anything bad about their character or plays up to a stereotype that's negative. It just plays up to some very innocent preconceived notions. Now that's Eric Trueheart writing right there, this sort of arguing and bickering. Pointless, mindless bickering. And Jonan, of course, always adding in goth girls. The whole series of Zim was probably the first series I've ever seen with some sort of a specific design or cultural style imposed on it that wasn't something average or overused. Like most people in animation, ever since Ren and Stimpy have been doing retro cartoons, they sort of have a 50s style. And everything's 50s. It has that googie sort of appearance and design sense. Whereas with Jonan, he went for this sort of goth industrial look, which I don't think anybody really does. People have tried to do stuff like that, but they never quite hit it. It always becomes very middle of the road. So very, blasé. And he'd come in and he'd throw in these goth characters. So there were a lot of goth girls running around, people wearing goth clothes. That's interesting because you never really saw that used effectively before. And yet, they're straightforward characters like Dib, but he's very goth. Doesn't necessarily act like a goth or, like the stereotypical goth that you'd see in most shows. Here's a joke that was thrown in by the border artist. This going for the axe. He threw that in to make it seem like he thought it was very odd that this grown man is luring this little boy back into this freezer chamber. So he wanted to mislead people, make them think that maybe this guy's going to murder Dib. But the guy is insane. And the blinking light added for effect. Sort of like lightning, but you couldn't really. It's very hard to do any sort of like very atmospheric effects inside a freezer. So it was actually a good touch that they added that light going off and on, and then Dib trying to screw it in to straighten it out. You'll see the sign here at the Sweaty Pits Apartments actually has a lot of the crew members' names. Turkey Neck. Very interesting character. This is where Louie began. I believe Louie did all this stuff in the apartment. Louis grew up in Manila, and I guess he grew up in places like this. So you see the woman out in her doorway eating on a TV tray. And I guess he would grow up in an area like that. I remember seeing that somewhere in my life as well, but he obviously had it stuck in his head. Turkey Neck being sort of a nice little nod to the Lucky Charms character from the cereal. The leprechaun.